In this recording, we're going to assess sociological explanations of the role of the mass media in creating moral panics about crime and deviance. So moral panics is where the media creates a massive exaggeration of deviance that is publicised and sensationalised by creating even more deviance that is close to the media's original exaggerations. The moral panic creates confusion over what deviant and what isn't deviant, and the confusion is aimed at the demonised group in the form of marginalisation and stigma. So the stages of a moral panic have been highlighted by Stanley Cohen, who studied the modern rockers in the 1960s. He found that a group was labelled in a negative way. The group were then demonised by the media. The media engaged in symbolisation. The media then invited moral entrepreneurs to the scene. The media then encouraged authorities to curb the problem, which then led to the group turning into a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you can use the example of the modern rockers, who, when the media sensationalised headlines such as the Day of Terror to describe the modern rockers as scuff, the media then portrays the group as folk devils, and moral entrepreneurs then condemn the group's behaviour. The focus on the dress, hairstyles and music the modern rockers wear becomes associated with trouble and violence, and the media then symbolise the group. The media's focus on the modern rockers led to a massive riot in which several people were injured. There are different reasons of why moral panics occur, and one of these is suggested due to when society is undergoing a moral crisis. Changes are usually linked with major social changes. For example, the youth in the 50s and 60s coincide with youth becoming a consumer group of its own right, with its own very distinctive values and norms, which were often viewed as immoral and threatening by the older generation. And Stanley Cohen believed that the emergence of the youth cultures were seen by the older generations undermining both the moral older and traditional authority. Another theory is proposed by the neo-Marxist Hall, who believes that moral panics are used by the capitalist state in order to divert attention from the mismanagement of capitalism. For example, in the 1970s, British capitalism experienced a crisis of hegemony, meaning that the cultural domination of the ruling class was challenged by economic recession, rising inflation and unemployment. A moral panic focused on the persistent media reporting crimes such as mugging, allegedly carried out by black people, was a divide and rule strategy which diverted the attention from the mismanagement of capitalism. However, it is very difficult to uncover evidence of collusion between the ruling class, the police, and the media to purposely create moral panics that act as political diversions. So if we look at the different reactions that moral panics can have, and one of them is to look at the reaction of the public. So functionalists argue that the role of media in crime and deviance is to reassert values and norms of society to the public. The role of the media is a positive function to society, as moral panics rise out of enemy created by change, and if moral panics flourish, for example, in peacetime after war, then there is a lot of change in enemy. The media dramatises events to reassert class consciousness when people are threatened. However, you could argue that there is no positive function in creating more deviance through self-fulfilling prophecies after a moral panic, which just creates larger groups of deviance than it was before, because deviance is amplified. The reaction to legislation can be shown by a young study who studied hippie marijuana users in Notting Hill in 1971 and found that due to the constant media reports of marijuana use, laws on drugs use have now been tightened. The reaction to the deviance can also have a negative impact because a self-fulfilling prophecy due to being demonized will develop as the group tries to resist the media's report. So going back to Jung's study, he found that drug use was a lifestyle, but due to labeling by the control culture led to the hippies to see themselves as outsiders. They developed into a deviant subculture, and then drug use became the central activity. Moral panics can be evaluated for their usefulness, which has been suggested by Munsey, who argues that moral panic theory has drawn our attention to the role and power the media play in defining normal and deviant behaviour. However, McRobbie and Thornton argued that the concept of moral panics is now outdated in this era of sophisticated and diverse media technology. Also, left realists believe that moral panics are often based on reality, and groups identified are often a real threat to those living in inner-city areas. However, moral panic theorists often deny the reality of the subject matter of moral panics and portray them as fantasies made up by journalists. Also, you could argue that moral panics are simply to make a profit. Moral panics don't reflect social anxieties held by the majority of society's members. They are quite simply the product of a desire of journalists to sell newspapers. So in conclusion, moral panics are a good example of how audiences are manipulated by the media for commercial purposes, and left realists like Lee and Young believe that portraying such crime as a fantasy product of the mass media is naive because such crime has real negative outcomes for people living in inner city areas.